The message arrived as I was finishing setting the table for Thanksgiving dinner. My fingers stopped folding the napkin when I read the words glowing on my phone screen. You won't be joining us on the Christmas cruise. Your father would prefer it to be just the family. My mother, Linda, had sent it as if it were a casual reminder about the weather. No explanation. No apology. Just a cold, calculated exclusion. I was still holding the linen napkin when the second message arrived. We hope you understand. It's simpler this way. My eyes stared at those words for long seconds. Simpler. Sure, it was simpler now that they had what they wanted. My name is Jesse, and at 34, I just found out that buying your parents a $400,000 house doesn't guarantee you a seat at the family dinner table. 3 months ago, when my father, Robert, called to tell me they were losing their house due to financial problems, I didn't hesitate for a second. I used all my savings, sold my apartment in Seattle, and moved to rural Oregon to be near them. I bought the house in my name but let them live there as if it were theirs. You're our hero, Jesse, my mother had said, tears streaming down her face. We don't know how to thank you. My father had hugged me tightly that day, whispering, you saved our family, son. Now, looking at that message, I understood perfectly what had happened. I was no longer useful. The house was secure, the debts were paid, and now they could go back to the life they had before, without the son who had saved them. I put the phone on the table and continued clearing the dishes. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was elsewhere. I was calculating, thinking, planning, because what they didn't know was that I had learned a lot about real estate contracts in the last few months. A lot about property rights. And a lot about protecting investments. The house was in my name. Completely. And I had documentation for every penny I had spent saving my family. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my sister, Kelly. I heard about the cruise. I'm sorry, Jesse. You know how they are. Yes, I knew exactly how they were. It had taken me 34 years to finally see clearly. I finished clearing the table and sat down in the chair where my father used to sit when he visited my apartment. Now he was in the house I bought, planning a vacation I indirectly paid for, celebrating a life I built for him. The irony burned more than the anger. I picked up my laptop and started doing some research. About property laws in Oregon. About squatters' rights. About how to proceed when people reside on your property without a formal lease. As I researched, my phone rang. It was my mother. Jesse? Honey, did you see my message? I did, I replied, my voice calmer than I expected. You understand, don't you? It's just that, well, you know how your father gets stressed out with a lot of people. And Kelly's taking the kids, so. I understand perfectly, Mom. An awkward silence spread across the line. You're not mad, are you? No, Mom. I'm not mad. And it was true. I wasn't mad. I was determined. After I hung up, I went back to my laptop. I found exactly what I was looking for. In the state of Oregon, landlords can require tenants to vacate the property with 30 days written notice. 30 days. I opened a blank document and started typing. Notice of termination of occupancy. As I typed, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't satisfaction or revenge. It was clarity. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. They thought I was just the useful son who showed up when they needed money. They had no idea that I was also the son who had inherited my grandfather's business acumen, the same grandfather who built a business from the ground up and taught me that boundless kindness is weakness. The document was almost finished when my phone buzzed again. It was a photo in the family group chat, my parents smiling at a travel agency, holding cruise brochures. The caption read, "We finally booked it. We can't wait." I smiled for the first time in hours. They really had no idea what was coming. If you're enjoying this story about how we sometimes have to make difficult decisions to protect our own dignity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what my parents didn't know was that their dream home was about to become their nightmare. And I had learned that sometimes love comes with consequences. I printed out the document and put it in an envelope. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of mind I hadn't felt in months. As I was making coffee, my phone buzzed with a message from the family group my parents had created. It was a photo of them at the dealership, posing next to a new BMW, with the caption, "We finally traded in that old car. Life is getting better." That old car was a 2015 Honda Civic that ran perfectly. They just decided they deserved something better. With what money? Well, now I knew exactly what money. My sister Kelly replied immediately, "Wow, how luxurious. How did you do it?" My dad typed back, "We worked hard our whole lives. It was time to treat ourselves." They worked hard. Sure. I sat down at the kitchen table and began mentally reviewing the last 6 months. Now that the fog of blind generosity had cleared, the patterns were obvious. First, there was the heater emergency. My father called me in a panic, saying the system had broken down in the middle of winter and they needed $3,000 right away. I transferred the money immediately, without question. 2 weeks later, Kelly casually mentioned that she had visited the house and noticed that the heater looked brand new, much more modern than what was needed for an emergency. Then came my mother's unexpected medical bill. $5,000 for an urgent procedure that insurance didn't cover. Again, I transferred without hesitation. Months later, during a family dinner, I overheard my mother telling a friend about her new facial treatment, bragging about the amazing results. And then came the talk about losing the house. The dramatic phone call from my father, his voice shaky, explaining that they were facing foreclosure due to bad investments and unexpected medical bills. "Jesse, you're our only child who can help us," he had said, his voice heavy with shame and despair. "I know it's a lot to ask, but you've always been our hero." Hero. That word echoed in my mind now with a bitter taste. I had sold my prized apartment in Seattle, used all my savings, and moved to a smaller town in Oregon, all to save my parents from a crisis that, I now realize, they had carefully orchestrated. What struck me most was the theatricality of it all. My mother's tears when we signed the papers for the house. My father's lingering hug. The words about not knowing how to thank me, and about me always having a home with them. All rehearsed. All calculated. My phone rang, interrupting my retrospective analysis. It was my mother. "Hi, honey. How are you? You didn't sound very happy when we talked yesterday." Her voice had that sugary tone I now recognized as manipulation disguised as maternal concern. "I'm fine, Mom. Just processing the news." "What news?" "Oh, you mean about the cruise?" "Jesse, you need to understand that this isn't personal. It's just that, well, you know how complicated things get when a lot of people are involved." "A lot of people?" "Well, Kelly's taking her 3 kids, and your father gets stressed out by noise, and you know how small cruise ship cabins are." She was improvising excuses in real time. Every word confirmed that the exclusion had been premeditated and deliberate. "I see," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "And how much did this cruise for the whole family cost?" A brief silence. "Oh, not much. We got a special discount. And well, we deserve a vacation after everything we've been through." Everything they've been through. As if they were the victims of their own financial situation. "I'm sure you do," I said, and I meant it. They deserved exactly what I was about to give them. After I hung up, I went to my laptop and opened the folder of financial documents I had compiled during the house purchase. There it was, the transfer receipts, the debt discharge documents, the property purchase agreement, all in my name. But there was something else interesting in the papers. During the mortgage approval process, I had discovered that my parents had lied about several things. They weren't facing foreclosure. In fact, they had refinanced the house months earlier, taking out equity for investments. Those investments? A new car for my mother. Expensive furniture. An unnecessary backyard renovation. And apparently, a fund for family vacations, as long as family didn't include the son who paid for everything. The reality was even colder than I had imagined. They hadn't simply used me to solve a crisis, they had created a crisis to use me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Kelly. "Jesse, can I call you? I need to talk about this cruise situation." I called her right back. "Jesse, I didn't know they didn't invite you until yesterday," she began, her voice heavy with guilt. "When I found out, I confronted Mom about it." "And what did she say?" "That it was Dad's idea. That he said you're going through a tough financial time, and that it would be embarrassing for you to see everyone spending money you don't have." I laughed. A dry, humorless laugh. "Tight financially. Interesting, considering I just saw them buy a new car. They bought a new car? BMW. They posted it on the family group this morning. Kelly was silent for a long moment. Jesse, how long has this been going on? What? They're using you. Treating you like their personal bank. The question hit me like a punch in the stomach because it forced me to acknowledge something I'd been avoiding admitting. This wasn't new. It was just the first time they'd been so blatant about it. Remember when you graduated with your MBA? Kelly continued. They barely showed up at your graduation, but 2 weeks later Dad called you asking for money to invest in that used car business that never took off? I remembered. $10,000 I never saw again. And when you got your first big promotion, Mom suddenly needed that loan to remodel the kitchen? $15,000. Also never paid back. Jesus, Kelly. How did I not see this before? Because you wanted to believe they loved you, she replied softly. And maybe they do, in their own twisted way. But they definitely see you as a resource. After I hung up with Kelly, I sat in silence for almost an hour. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. They had been playing a game with me for years, and I had participated willingly, blinded by my need for parental approval. But now the rules had changed. Now I knew what game we were playing. And unlike them, I was actually good at strategy. I went back to the eviction document I had started drafting the night before. But now, with a complete understanding of the situation, I realized that a simple eviction would be too small. Too limited. They hadn't just excluded me from a trip. They had excluded me from the family while living off my generosity. And apparently, they planned to continue doing so indefinitely. I opened a new folder on my computer and named it Project Consequences. Inside, I began cataloging every lie, every manipulation, every penny they had extracted from me under false pretenses. Not to wallow in self-pity, but to document. Because what they didn't know was that I had inherited something from my grandfather besides business acumen. I had inherited his patience for long-term planning. The phone rang again. It was my father. Jesse, my boy. How are you? Fine, Dad. Enjoying a quiet day. Great, great. Look, I called because your mother said you were a little upset about the cruise situation, and I wanted to explain. There's no need to explain, Dad. I understand perfectly. Oh, I'm glad. I knew you would understand. You've always been our most mature son. You've always known that family comes first. Family comes first. The irony was so thick I almost choked. Without a doubt, Dad. Family comes first. Exactly. And when we get back, we'll organize a special dinner just for you. Maybe we can even share some vacation photos. I can't wait. After I hung up, I looked out the window of my small rented apartment, the place I lived because I had sold my house to save theirs. Outside, the autumn sun lit up the golden leaves on the trees. It was a beautiful day. Perfect for starting something new. I went back to my computer and began researching not only property laws, but also lawyers who specialized in asset recovery. Because if they wanted to play the selective family game, I would play it to the end. And in my version of that game, the consequences would be proportional to the actions. They were about to find out that excluding the wrong child from a family can be the most expensive mistake anyone ever makes. If you're following this story and want to see how a family betrayal can turn into the biggest regret of a lifetime, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because my parents had no idea that while they were planning their dream vacation with my money, I was planning the rude awakening of their lives. 3 days later, while scrolling through my parents' vacation posts on Facebook, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. Jesse? This is Tom Bradley from the law firm Bradley and Associates. Your father gave me your contact information. My stomach sank. Why would my father be talking to a lawyer about me? Hello, Tom. How can I help you? Well, it's about the property on Elm Street. Your parents want to make some changes to the paperwork. They mentioned that you had agreed to transfer the property back to their name officially. I laughed. A short, bitter laugh. I'm sorry, Tom, but there must be some misunderstanding. I never agreed to that. There was an uncomfortable pause. Oh. Well, they seemed pretty sure about it. In fact, we've already started preparing the paperwork. They said it was just a formality, since you bought the house as a gift. A gift they want back officially while they're disowning me? Tom cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Maybe you guys should work this out as a family first. I'll put our work on hold until we have a clear direction. After I hung up, I sat at my dining room table for at least an hour, just breathing. They weren't just disowning me. They were trying to legally steal the house I had bought. The audacity was staggering. My phone buzzed with a message from Kelly. "Jesse, I need to tell you something. I'm on my way." She arrived an hour later, carrying a manila folder and a grim expression. "I sat down with my accountant yesterday," she began, before even sitting down. "I asked her to review some old tax documents after our conversation about Mom and Dad." Kelly spread papers across the table. "Jesse, they weren't facing foreclosure when they called you. In fact, they had refinanced the house 2 months earlier, taking out $80,000 in equity." $80,000. "There's more," she continued, her voice growing more tense. "Remember when Dad said he lost money on some bad investments? I found the statements. He bought a boat. A $25,000 boat that he keeps at a marina 40 miles away." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. "Kelly, they made me sell my apartment in Seattle for a lie." "I know. And it gets worse." She slid another document across the table. "This is a life insurance application Mom filled out last month. She named you as the beneficiary of a $200,000 policy. Is that good?" Kelly shook her head. "Jesse, she's 62 years old and in perfect health. Why would she suddenly take out such a high life insurance policy and specifically name you as the beneficiary?" The implication hit me like a punch in the stomach. They're creating evidence that I have financial motivation to hurt them. Exactly. If something happened to them, especially after you found out about the financial manipulation, you'd be the prime suspect. And with $200,000 as a motive. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, children played in the park, their laughter echoing through the quiet afternoon. Normal life. Normal families. "Kelly, they're not just stealing from me. They're setting me up to be accused of something terrible if I try to defend myself." "It sure looks like it. Jesse, you need professional help. This goes beyond a family feud." I turned to her. "Are you sure about all this?" "I have copies of everything. Bank statements, insurance applications, refinancing documents. All with date stamps." At that moment, a strange clarity settled over me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was pure determination. "Kelly, would you support me if I decided to fight back?" "Jesse, I don't know what you're planning, but you need to be careful. They're clearly several steps ahead of you. Or they think they are." I grabbed my phone and started researching law firms that specialized in family fraud. Because what my parents didn't know was that spending years managing complex projects in Seattle had taught me a thing or two about long-term strategy. They had underestimated one crucial thing. I was no longer the naive young man who always gave in to their manipulations. I was a 34-year-old man with resources, connections, and most importantly, documentation of everything. While Kelly organized the papers, I called the first firm on my list. "Morrison & Lewis Law Firm, how can I help you?" "I'd like to schedule a consultation regarding family fraud and misappropriation of assets." "Certainly, sir. What day would be convenient?" "Today, if possible. It's urgent." After I hung up, Kelly looked at me with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Jesse, are you sure about this?" "Kelly, they've spent years using me as their personal bank. Now they're trying to frame me while they steal my property. You think I should just take it?" She shook her head slowly. "No. In fact, I think it's time someone showed them there are consequences." 2 hours later, I was sitting in the office of Margaret Morrison, a 60-year-old lawyer specializing in family asset recovery. She listened to the whole story without interruption, occasionally taking notes. "Jesse," she said finally, "you have a very solid case. Fraud, financial coercion, defamation of character. But I have to be honest, this is going to be brutal for your family." "They made it brutal when they decided to turn me into a potential criminal." Margaret nodded. "We're going to need a private investigator to document everything properly. And I'm going to need you to compile every transaction, every conversation, every broken promise. How long will that take? To build an airtight case? About 2 weeks. To implement it? Depends on how cooperative they decide to be when they find out you're no longer a passive victim. I left Margaret's office with a feeling I hadn't felt in months: control. My parents were enjoying their temporary victory somewhere in the Caribbean, celebrating how they had successfully manipulated their youngest son into financing their vacation and then accepting exclusion quietly. They had no idea that while they were posting photos of cocktails and sunsets, I was methodically building the case that would not only get my property back, but expose every lie they ever told. Kelly called me as I was pulling up to my house. "Jesse, I just saw more posts from the cruise. They're at an all-inclusive resort in the Bahamas. Mom posted a picture of her spending $800 on duty-free shopping." $800 of my money, I corrected her. "Are you still going through with this?" I looked down at the folder Margaret had given me, filled with legal forms and strategies. "Kelly, they didn't give me a choice. When you try to destroy someone preemptively, you force them to defend themselves. And defense, in my case, is going to look a lot like a counterattack." Because the truth was, my parents had made a fundamental mistake. They assumed I would remain the silent victim I had always been. But silent victims who own $400,000 worth of property and have documentation of years of financial manipulation don't remain victims for long. Especially when they discover that their own parents are trying to frame them for crimes they never committed. The war had begun the moment they signed that life insurance application. They just didn't know they'd lost yet. The morning after my meeting with Margaret, I woke up with a clarity of mind I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't anger that drove me anymore, it was surgical precision. As I made coffee, my phone buzzed with another update from the cruise. This time it was a photo of my parents at an expensive seafood restaurant, with the caption, "Finally living the dream. Thank you, life, for giving us this second chance." Second chance. With my money. I replied in the family group, "So glad to see you guys happy. Enjoy every moment." Kelly called me 20 minutes later. "Jesse, are you okay? Your reply seemed strange." "I'm great, Kelly. In fact, I've never been better." "Are you sure? Because it doesn't sound like you're planning something." I smiled. My sister knew me too well. Let's just say I'm reorganizing some priorities. By 9 in the morning, I was back at Margaret's office with 3 chronologically organized binders. Every document stamped with the date, every conversation legally recorded, every financial transaction documented. "Impressive," Margaret said, flipping through the papers. "Jesse, this isn't just organization, it's forensic-level documentation. I've learned to be meticulous in my work. Apparently, it's come in handy in my personal life as well." Margaret stopped at a specific page. "This life insurance application is particularly interesting. Does the timing coincide exactly with when you first became suspicious of financial manipulation?" "Yes. 3 days after our conversation about the lawyer, they contacted to transfer the house." "Jesse, this isn't just financial planning on their part. It's advance protection against accusations of fraud. If you found out what they were doing and confronted them publicly, they could claim you were motivated by the potential inheritance." I leaned forward. "So they didn't just steal from me. They turned me into a suspect in something I would never do." "Exactly. And that completely changes our strategy." Margaret opened a new folder and began taking notes. "Let's divide this into 3 phases. Phase 1. Completely protect his assets and reverse any authorizations they have. Phase 2. Document every instance of fraud with irrefutable evidence. Phase 3. Implement proportionate consequences." "How long for each phase?" "The first can be implemented immediately, a matter of hours. The second will take a week to compile properly. The third," she paused and looked at me directly. "The third depends on how far you want to take this." I thought for a moment. My hands were steady, my breathing calm. "I want them to face consequences proportional to what they did to me. No more, no less." Margaret nodded. "Then we start today." The first stop was the bank. Within 2 hours, all of my mother's authorizations had been revoked. Every account was protected with 2-factor authentication. Every transaction over $50 now required my personal approval. The second stop was the notary. Within an hour, a new will had been drafted, signed, and notarized. If anything happened to me, Kelly would inherit everything, not my parents. The third stop was a private investigator recommended by Margaret. James Crawford was 60 years old, gray-haired, and had an impeccable reputation in family fraud cases. His specialty was financial timeline reconstruction for complex litigation. "Your case is interesting," he said, reviewing my documents. "I usually see this kind of progressive manipulation in cases of financial abuse of the elderly. But here, they've adapted the techniques for an adult child. Is it possible to trace everything?" "Jesse, with the documentation you have, I can reconstruct not only the transactions, but also the intentions behind them. Every fake loan, every fabricated emergency, every emotional manipulation. And with the timing of the life insurance application." He shook his head slowly. "They were very meticulous in covering their tracks, but also very confident that you would never investigate. That combination always leaves evidence." As James explained his investigative process, my phone buzzed again. Another photo from the cruise, my parents at a casino, holding expensive cocktails, both smiling broadly. The caption read, "Luck has finally turned our way." I showed the photo to James. "They're spending money they stole from you while publicly celebrating their luck," he observed. "That's evidence of a complete lack of remorse." I left James's office with a clear timeline. 7 days to compile irrefutable evidence. 14 days to implement complete legal protections. And when my parents returned from their cruise, they would walk into a completely different world. That evening, Kelly showed up at my apartment unannounced. "Jesse, I need to know what you're planning." I made tea for us and we sat down at the small kitchen table. "Kelly, they didn't just steal from me. They orchestrated a situation where I would be suspected of trying to hurt them if I discovered the theft." "The life insurance." "Exactly. And the attempt to legally transfer the house while they're away. They're not just being greedy, Kelly. They're being strategic." Kelly was silent for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to protect myself. And I'm going to make sure they face appropriate consequences." "Jesse, are you sure you want to destroy the family like this?" I looked at her with a calmness that surprised me. "Kelly, they destroyed the family the moment they decided to turn me into a victim and then a suspect. I'm just documenting what they've done." If you're following this journey of discovery into how far family betrayal can go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next revelations will show that sometimes the family we think we know is a carefully constructed illusion. The next morning, I got a call from Tom Bradley, the lawyer my parents had hired. "Jesse, your parents called me from the cruise. They're concerned. They said you changed the passwords to some accounts and wanted to know if that affects our ability to process the property transfer." "Tom, as I said before, I never agreed to any transfer." "Well, they seem to think it's just a matter of you being emotionally upset about not being able to go on the cruise." "Tom, can I ask you a question? When they came to you to transfer a $400,000 property, did you ask why the son who bought the house for them wasn't involved in the discussion?" An uncomfortable silence. "Well, they explained that it was a surprise for you." "A surprise? Transferring my property without my knowledge would be a surprise. Jesse, maybe you guys should work this out when they get back." "I completely agree." After I hung up, I smiled for the first time in days. My parents were nervous. Nervous enough to call their lawyer in the middle of an expensive cruise. They were starting to realize that something had changed, but they didn't know what yet. On my desk, the 3 phases of Margaret's plan were organized into colorful folders. Phase 1, complete. Phase 2, in progress. Phase 3, awaiting implementation. I looked out the window of my apartment. In a week, my parents would return home expecting to find the same son who had always given in to their manipulations. Instead, they would find someone who had learned a lesson they had inadvertently taught me, that real families protect each other, they don't exploit each other. And protection sometimes means setting boundaries that hurt before they heal. I opened my laptop and began typing the first draft of a letter that would be delivered to them the moment they walked through the door. "Dear Mom and Dad, welcome back. We need to talk." The cursor blinked after that sentence, waiting for the words that would change everything forever. Words they had made inevitable the moment they chose greed over gratitude. 7 days later, I got the call I had been waiting for. "Jesse, they just landed," Kelly said, her voice tense. "Mom called me from the airport asking why her card was declined at duty-free." I looked at the clock. 3:15 in the afternoon. Perfect timing. "And what did you say?" "That I didn't know anything." "But Jesse," she sounded desperate. She said they tried 3 different cards and they were all declined. I closed the laptop where I was reviewing the final documents with Margaret and James. "Kelly, over the next few days, they're going to call you a lot. They'll make up stories about banking problems, hackers, anything. Don't believe a word of it." "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure they've made their choices. Now they'll have to live with the consequences." An hour later, my phone exploded with calls. First my mother, then my father, then my mother again. I let them all go to voicemail. At 5 o'clock, I finally answered. "Jesse." My mother practically screamed. "Thank God. We're having terrible problems with our cards. The bank must have made a mistake." "What kind of problems, Mom?" "They're all blocked. We couldn't even pay for the taxi from the airport. We had to call Kelly." "Interesting. They didn't mention that they had tried to access the accounts I had protected." "That's strange," I replied calmly. "Did you try calling the bank?" "Of course we did. They said all the authorizations had been revoked by you." "Jesse, what's going on?" There it was. The first moment of recognition. "Mom, did you guys talk to Tom Bradley while you were out of town?" A silence. "Tom? The lawyer?" "Well, your father may have mentioned some documents." "Documents about transferring my house into your names?" The silence stretched out. I could almost hear my mother rapidly calculating which version of the story would be most convincing. "Jesse, honey, this is a misunderstanding. We just wanted to." "You just wanted to steal my property while cutting me out of the family?" "Steal?" "Jesse, how can you say that? We're your parents." "Parents who tried to frame me for preventive murder with a life insurance policy?" This time, there was complete silence. "Jesse, what are you talking about?" But her voice had changed. Panic was setting in. "Mom, you'll be home in an hour. When you get there, we're going to have a talk. A very enlightening talk." I hung up before she could respond. At 6:30, I saw the taxi pull up in front of the house I had bought for them. I was parked across the street, watching through the tinted windows of my rental car. My parents got out of the taxi carrying expensive suitcases, tanned and still wearing their vacation clothes. My mother was talking excitedly on the phone, probably with Tom Bradley. It was when my father tried to open the front door that the first real shock hit me. The key didn't work. I watched him try several times, then bang on the door, then pick up the phone. 2 minutes later, my cell phone rang. "Jesse, the lock is broken. We can't get into the house." "Dad, the lock isn't broken. You don't live there anymore." "What do you mean you don't live there anymore?" "I mean the property was sold yesterday. The new owners are moving in on Monday." The phone was silent for so long that I thought the call had been dropped. "Jesse," my mother had picked up the phone, her voice now shaky. "Stop playing games. Open the door now." "Mom, this isn't a game. And I can't open a door to a house that doesn't belong to me anymore." "Jesse, we live here." "No, you lived here. Out of courtesy. Courtesy that was revoked when I found out you were trying to rob me." I saw through the windshield as my mother began banging on the front door, then the windows. My father was pacing circles in the yard, the phone glued to his ear. My phone rang again. "Jesse, this is ridiculous. You can't leave us homeless." "Dad, you had a home. You sold it to get $80,000 in equity, then lied to me about facing foreclosure." Silence. "How? Where did you get that information?" "From the same source that told me about the $25,000 boat you bought at the Cedar Bay Marina." Another long pause. "Jesse, we can explain all this." "I'm sure you can. In fact, I'd really like to hear your explanations. Meet me at Denny's on Main Street in an hour." "But Jesse, where are we going to sleep tonight?" "Good question. Maybe Kelly can suggest something. I hung up and drove to Denny's. An hour later, my parents walked into the restaurant. They were visibly shaken, messy hair, wrinkled clothes, dark circles under their eyes that had nothing to do with jet lag. They sat down at the booth across from me without saying a word. "Welcome back," I said calmly, sliding a manila folder across the table. "I hope you enjoyed your vacation." My father opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were copies of all the documents James had compiled: bank statements, life insurance application, refinancing documents, photos of the boat, records of the conversation with Tom Bradley. I saw the moment when reality sank in on their faces. "Jesse," my mother whispered, "you investigated your own parents?" "Mom, you tried to frame me for murder." "Investigation was the least I could do." My father closed the folder and looked at me directly. "What do you want, Jesse?" The question I had been waiting for. "I want you to face the consequences of your choices." "What consequences?" I slid a second folder across the table. "Lawsuits for fraud, misappropriation of assets, financial coercion, and attempted incrimination. Margaret Morrison, my lawyer, believes we have a strong enough case to recover every penny you stole from me, plus punitive damages." My mother turned pale. "Jesse, are you talking about putting your own parents in jail?" "I'm talking about justice. You spent years using me as your personal bank, then tried to cut me out of the family while stealing my property." My father leaned forward. "Jesse, we're a family. We can work this out as a family." I laughed. A dry laugh that echoed through the empty cabin. Family? Family was when you needed money. When you wanted an exclusive vacation, I stopped being family. "But you can choose," my mother said quickly. "You control that now." "I do," I replied, standing up from the table. "And I choose consequences." I left both briefcases on the table and walked toward the door. "Jesse!" my father shouted after me. "Where are we going to sleep tonight?" I stopped at the door and turned around. "You're intelligent adults who have spent the last few years planning how to manipulate me. I'm sure you can figure something out." I left the restaurant knowing that my parents finally understood that the useful, silent son had died the moment he received that text message about the cruise. And in his place was someone they never expected to face, someone who documented everything, planned carefully, and most importantly, someone who was no longer afraid to say no. The phone rang as I was pulling into the driveway. It was Kelly. "Jesse, they just called me. They're begging to sleep at my place." "And what did you say?" I said I needed to think. "Jesse, they're devastated. Mom's crying, Dad looks like he aged 10 years. I looked out the window of my apartment. The city glowed peacefully under the night lights. "Kelly, they made their choice when they decided I was disposable. Now they've discovered that disposable people sometimes keep documents." Because my parents were about to find out that kicking the wrong kid out of the family can be the most expensive mistake you ever make. And tomorrow, when they woke up, no matter where they were, they would discover that his consequences were just beginning. 6 months later, I got the call I'd been waiting for. It was Margaret. "Jesse, they've accepted the settlement. Full payment for all financial losses, plus $15,000 for damages. And they've waived any future claims on you or your assets." I looked out the window of my new apartment in Portland. I was back to my life, but it was different. Kelly showed up that afternoon with coffee and news. They moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the cheap side of town. Dad got a part-time job at Walmart. Mom, well, she's learning that manipulation isn't a transferable skill. And the boat. Sold to pay the lawyers. 3 days later, my mother called. Her voice was different, smaller, older. "Jesse, we wanted to say we're sorry. Thanks for saying that. Do you think, someday, we could try again?" I closed my eyes and thought about the question she was really asking. "Mom, you need to learn how to live without my money before you learn how to live with me." I hung up and smiled. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about setting boundaries. The next month, I started a consulting business helping people protect themselves from family fraud. Kelly became my first employee. "Don't you feel angry anymore?" she asked one day. "No. I feel gratitude." Gratitude. They taught me the difference between being loved and being used. That lesson is worth more than any house. If this story of transformation and setting boundaries touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories of overcoming adversity and justice. Today, 2 years later, my business is thriving, helping others regain their financial dignity. My parents? Well, they finally learned the real value of money, when it's theirs. Sometimes the greatest kindness we can show someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices. Because only when we stop being someone's savior do they learn to save themselves.